Hello and welcome to my lecture review using the JBL book, Risk Management Fundamentals. This book is written by Gibson and Andy Igonor. It's again, Managing Risk and Information System, 3rd edition. It is a Jones and Bartlett book, ISBN number 9781284183719. Again, they own all the copyrights. All I am doing is preparing lecture review for the PowerPoints that they own the rights to. So with that said, let's jump in and let's see what we can do. Chapter 4, Developing a Risk Management Plan. So in this module, we're going to be describing the components of and the approaches to effective risk management within an organization. So key concepts we're going to be focusing on are the components of risk management plan, the objectives, boundaries, and scope of the plan, the importance of assigning responsibilities, significance for planning, scheduling, and documentation, and reporting of your plan. And we're going to be looking at the steps within the NISC risk management framework. So, again, we're going to look at kind of what are the overall objectives of what that plan is for. So the plan, the best it can, identifies all of the risks. So it provides a list of those threats within the organization that pertains to that organization. A list of vulnerabilities. Those allow you to start getting that list of risks that have been identified. You're going to be doing the cost associated with the risks. You're going to develop a list of recommendations for each risk. So you might have, risk 1. And you might have a subcategory. And cat 1, cat 2, cat 3. And then each one of those categories might have a subcategory of recommendations or potential items for risk mitigation, and then an actual recommendation for that specific risk. That way it shows that you have put thought and effort into that. It wasn't just one and done. So that would be the recommendations for mitigating risk or lowering risk. Costs associated, because you might actually have a list of mitigation and you might have a dollar amount for each one of these. And you might say that this is the recommendation and this is why, but you might provide additional information. That way, if this option no longer is valid, you already have a backup solution and a backup of a backup solution. That does help with the cost-benefit analysis, or the CBA. The interesting thing here is if you list your risk mitigation costs and you have more than a single recommendation, you can weight it. Hey, we're doing this option because this is the cost. Here are other avenues, but this is the cost associated with it. Thus, we're doing this because. And then the appropriate reports that you are needing for your organization. All right, so what are some of the steps we have to deal with? First, implementing a risk management plan is document the decisions. What are management talking about? What are the things that they're identifying? So you have to do this part first. You have to have management buy-in. You have to make sure that they're doing a scope that's appropriate to what they've outlined. And then that drives into document and track implementation of the recommendations. So what will happen is you'll start getting, a list together of items. And then, again, as we're looking at tracking each of these items, then we have to see which ones are allowed to move on to the next steps. So the track of implementation of the appropriate recommendations. Because we may say, we want this. This is the solution. And we may go, oh, no, we don't want that. So we have to have documentation of the appropriate ones. And then from there, we can start building out the plan, action, and milestones POEM. Plan of action and milestones. Because, again, we're not actually doing any implementation here. We're just talking about what would the recommendations be. Once we have the acceptance of those recommendations, then we can start building out the plan. So from here, we would then identify the objectives, identifying threats, the vulnerabilities, assets, and assigning responsibilities. Who should be doing what? If malware infects the computer, what do we do? Assigning responsibilities to each of the areas. That way, in a chaotic moment, we clearly have an outline of structure. We are not just willy-nilly. We have a dedicated plan. We have a team that's knowing what they're supposed to be doing, and then we're able to then respond. So assigning responsibility is a big one that oftentimes is overlooked. Identifying the costs. Cost of what if we do nothing? Cost of the outage. Cost of non-compliance. The cost of compliance. That way we can say, to secure this $100 product, it might cost us $10,000. Well, we might go, oh, that's not worth it. So we don't do it. If we say, hey, to secure this $100 item, it's going to cost $10,000. And if we don't do that, the cost of non-compliance might be $50,000, for example. Then we can go, oh, that makes sense. Cost of non-compliance is higher than the cost of compliance. So we get justification. We could provide recommendations and provide lots of recommendations, and typically with a cost associated with each one of them. That way we could figure out the best path forward. Identifying the cost of the recommendation. That way we can do our cost-benefit analysis. Again, businesses have to make money. So we have to talk in terms of cost that the business knows that they're getting a value, and we can justify it. Other objective examples are things like the documentation, the tracking, and that creating of the action and milestones. People don't like to look at this as a project, but if you're familiar with project management, there are going to be lots of similarities. A risk plan, a risk management plan, is a big project. Actually, there is a specialty in project management for risk managers. So the scope of a risk management plan: identify the boundaries, avoid scope creep, that's a big one. What are your functional requirements? What are the things that you have to accomplish? And not like to haves, again, that's going to be scope creep. What are the things you have to have? That's your boundaries. Identify the appropriate stakeholders. Create and develop a change control board. If we need to modify anything, what's the process? And then, what's the overall scope? Define the scope. That way, we know that this plan is actionable and completable. The one big thing with big projects like this is oftentimes they become so bloated and there is no end in sight. So these 5 steps aid us in the development of a actionable and completable plan. So, scope examples. Let's say we're creating a risk management plan to secure a website. You define the scope. Let me grab my pen actually. Security of the server hosting the website, security of the website itself, availability of the website, and the integrity. Stakeholders might be IT, might be marketing or the head of sales. It might be the vendor supplying the website hosting. What's required? Written approval for all activities outside the scope. So anything outside the identified scope, we might go, we need to identify what's going on. All right. So for another compliance, another big one like HIPAA, identifying the scope, identify health data, storing health data, using health data, and transmitting health data. Those are going to be the things that are outlining our EPHI. That way we know what we have to protecting. Who are the main stakeholders? CIO and HR. Maybe legal. And then again, anything outside of this scope, we have to then get approval for. So, how do we assign responsibilities? So, you normally look at the stakeholders, the departments, the executives. You look at risk management team, and those are the ones that we're assigning those responsibilities to. If we're looking at the individuals, you need to identify the risk, assessing the risk, identifying the mitigation, and reporting. If we know we're dealing with securing a website and IT is the party in charge of handling that, so we might assign the responsibility to the head of that project, or the head of IT, or to the member of IT handling the project. That way, there's someone that we've identified as the lead for that project. Responsibilities, continuing on, could be, again, the department, whether it's IT, whether it is sales. And then we can go one step further and we can identify the key stakeholders at the executive level, like the CFO, for validation and for the CBA. So this group will be responsible for these actions. This group will be responsible for these actions. That's what we mean by diving into responsibilities. We can identify who's responsible for the overall project, and then we could start subcategorizing each of the major objectives in there. So since we did a website and HIPAA compliance, here HR would be in charge of this group, IT in charge of this group, and again, executives for this group. This is not an exhaustive list. You do need to develop a plan for your own organization, and again, there are risk management frameworks out there that aid in this development, namely NIST. So using an affirmative diagram, we could identify threats and then recommendations, and then we could actually look at the vulnerabilities, and then we could map them. How do we prevent this? We could figure out which one. And then from there, we could identify costs. And then we could identify one recommendation. And the vulnerabilities, same thing. We could identify the different sets of vulnerabilities, and then we could then figure out the appropriate costs for mitigation, and then we would figure out which one of them would be the appropriate recommendation for each identified vulnerability. Because each identified vulnerability will have associated costs and risks. From there, we would probably take up 3 or 5 of individual risk options or vulnerabilities, the risk for that vulnerability. From there, 3 to 5 risk mitigating techniques. From there, selecting and recommending one. So, like open ports. Here are the different risk items that we could do, and each one of those would have an associated cost, and then one of those associated costs would be the recommendation that we would be making. So describing the procedure and schedule for accomplishment, again, milestones. We want to make sure this project is functional, we can roll with it. Include recommendations of solutions for the threats and identified vulnerabilities with goal of mitigation of the appropriate risk. Solutions will oftentimes have multiple steps and verification steps. Describe each of the steps in detail. So when you're making your recommendation, we're doing this recommendation and this is why. Describe it in detail. Include a timeline. We can't just say we're going to do this without providing a timeline and costs. Remember, management is responsible for choosing the control to implement, and management is responsible for the residual risk. We identify the risks, we identify the mitigation techniques, we identify the costs, we make a recommendation, and then management takes it from there. So, procedural examples. So, we identify a vulnerability. So, mitigate the risk for denying DOS. Recommendation, upgrade the firewall. This is why. And if this is what we're going to be doing, here's the procedure that we're going to take. Start firewall logging, create a policy, purchase a new appliance, install the appliance, configure the appliance, test, and then bring it online. Could that be way deeper than this? Most definitely, but this is a good first step. If we're dealing with HIPAA, maybe we're going to be dealing with the procedure for mitigating the risk of HIPAA non-compliance. Simple option would be increase the awareness of HIPAA requirements. Justification would be, again, focusing on non-compliance. Procedure, how would we accomplish this? Again, these are very general, very broad. You'd want to tailor them specific to your organization. Then we deal with the reporting. Present the recommendation. Document the management response to the recommendation. Document and track implementation and the accepted recommendation. Build out your plan of action and milestones. That way, you have your timeline, you have your actions, you have your milestones, you have a project that you can then focus and complete. Alright, so let's talk about presentation recommendations. So, the report should definitely include your findings, your CBA, your time frame, justification of your recommendations. So the reports are often summarized in risk statements. So use risk statements so that, one, it communicates a risk and the resulting impact, as well as how you're going to resolve it. So findings, cause, the threat, criteria, that will be allowing the threat to succeed. Maybe inadequate manpower, bad firewalls, no IDS, what's happening. And then the effect. If this happens, this will be a response. So if, virus comes in and the criteria is we don't have centralized AV, the effect could be viruses spread to machines. So, cause and criteria. The attack, what happens, what's the issue, what's the outage. So, if an attack occurs, no IDS. If we don't have the appropriate manpower, then we don't able to update things. If we don't have a managed firewall, we might not have antivirus software. Base the attack, and then work through the problem, and then what's the outage? So you might also do it things like loss of confidentiality, no access control, no policies, procedures. The effect might be a legal or financial concern. They don't always have to be a specific, we might get a virus. We might just write it general enough to show, hey, we might have a legal issue if we do not do things correctly. So recommendations for the cost and time frame. Again, this is a list of recommendations for the website. Maybe we upgrade the firewall. We purchase an IDS. We create a plan for updating the hardware. We install AV. We install anti-spam, anti-malware. We make sure we have a plan there for updating the software. And we might add correct personnel. The cost-benefit analysis should provide us the cost of the recommendation and anticipated ongoing costs. We should also be able to develop the project benefits in terms of dollars. So again, looking at the website, we'll do the CBA. The recommendation, cost of the recommendation, the background, the loss, expected loss with the recommendation, expected loss without the recommendation, the benefit of the recommendation, the cost-benefit analysis, and that allows us to identify the selected risks and costs associated with this. We will develop a risk statement. Use communicating a risk and result impact, often written if-then. You should normally match this to the scope and the objectives of the project. So our objective is this. If we don't do this, then this could happen. You might see it as this. So accept, defer, or modify. So we might see that we build our plan, we send it to management. They may accept it and allow us to move forward with the recommendation. They may defer the recommendation so that we can deal with this a little bit later. Or they may say, hey, we don't like this, let's modify it so we have some type of an adjustment. So moving on to the documenting and tracking implementation of the accepted recommendations. Again, you need to develop the documentation. The documentation doesn't need to be extensive. It could be very simple. This is the recommendation. This is what we're going to be doing. So, recommendation for buying AV. It was accepted. Timeline. When should it be completed? Recommendation to hire another personnel. Might be deferred. Recommendation for timeline might be when we might revisit it. Recommendation to purchase a firewall was modified. So then we say what is modified to and what's the timeline, what's the time frame, when should we be following up on this. Understand that our plan of action and milestones are a living document. They'll be modified, they'll be adjusted, they'll grow and shrink. We use this to track the progress of the project. We use this for responsibility and allow management to follow up as well as other personnel to follow up based off of the needs of the project. So you could be charting the project. When is it going to start? What milestones we have? And then we can put it on a milestone chart. Or we could build a Gantt chart. If you're familiar with project management, we'll be building out a Gantt chart so that we can see the flow of the project and what resources are necessary. And you can track that via a timeline. You can identify the critical paths, chart the identified critical tasks to be managed, and then build out the appropriate time frame. So how do we do all of this? Honestly, most organizations build it out based off of the NIST Risk Management Framework, or the RMF. And that's a 7-step process. Prepare, categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, monitor, rinse, repeat. This is not an in-depth overview of how to use the framework. This is just one is getting familiar with the process. And that's actually it for this introductory module. We look through the fundamental components of the plan, the objectives, boundaries, and scope of the plan, importance of assigning responsibilities, the significance of planning, scheduling, and documentation, as well as reporting, and then we looked at just the basic steps for our risk management framework. Questions, issues, concerns, please feel free to reach out. Thank you. Alrighty, well thank you. That concludes this lecture review. Again, all material presented in this PowerPoint lecture was copyrighted by Jones and Bartlett Learning. So they own the copyright. I am just providing a lecture on the PowerPoints that they provided. With that said, if you have any questions, thoughts, issues, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me, leave a comment, get in touch with me, and I will get those addressed as quickly as I can. Thank you.